Translation Nation in primary schools is about the country of words that anyone can travel to from whatever direction and by any means of transport. What do I mean by that? It's the brainchild of the Stephen Spender Trust in partnership with Eastside Educational Trust. It's been funded by Arts Council England, Esme Fairbairn and Mercers. And it particularly aims to do three things. The first is to highlight and normalise the huge diversity of languages spoken in schools around the country, as well as celebrating the often unrecognised role played by students as translators and interpreters between home and the outside world. This is affirmed by them collaborating alongside career translators. Secondly, it's about showing that translation is an exciting route into creative writing, rigorous drafting and editing, and thoughtful and confident self-expression, i.e. literacy. So it's an alternative route into literacy. And thirdly, that it introduces students to the idea of a world literature that could be accessible to anyone. So it's a world where Aesop's The Boy Who Cried Wolf sits alongside Ali the Liar in a Somalian version about a boy who cries hyena, and seeing how all that works along. So I've raised this term world literature, and this might not be what you think of when I first say world literature. Anyone any idea how many languages that's been translated into? Let's hear a guess. 53? 83, down from 83 and up from 53. 67. 60, including ancient Greek and Latin. And I was lucky, I went to a conference in UNESCO in 2008 where they got together half those translators from around the world and what different experiences they had. Why am I showing you this? Because on day one of Translation Nation, one of the things we do is get the translators to expose children to the idea of these books travelling around the world, how they change physically as objects, how the titles change, and this extraordinary phenomenon of an English book travelling along. And here you get just a few of those covers, and there's great excitement guessing what might be going on there. And then you get, oh, that one too. That. So Harry Potter has been translated into 67 different languages, but back home, as we know, we have these very small percentages of books that are translated from other languages into English, between 1% and 3%. So one of the things we're kind of encouraging students to think about, they have this enormous asset. They have these languages that are currently underrepresented, massively underrepresented in the Anglophone publishing world. What would happen if these people become the translators of the future, if they are translating the books that Dylan's talking about? Just step you quickly through the structure of it. So translation begins with the communications between the translator and the teacher, and that starts long before the programme is embedded in the school, and that can be informal communications, or it can be something almost approaching a twilight inset training session. And that's one of the challenging areas that we'll pick up on later, that business of how you embed it right. It takes place over 3 days, spread across an average of 2 weeks, giving the school time to harvest oral stories from parents, family members, and the community network. On day one, you have this general approach to translation, including the activities I've shown you, getting children to translate books from languages that they probably don't have, where they're acting off the pictures, and getting involved in the translation process generally. From day two, we're getting adults to come into the classroom to tell a story in their mother tongue, and their tale is translated by the relevant child, or it might have already been transliterated and put into a rough translation by another adult. What if English is the only language spoken at home? Children can go and interview a neighbour, a shopkeeper, a friend's parents, anyone they might know who has a story to tell in another language or another register. This is absolutely a project for multilingual but also monolingual children. It's about the shift between register. It's about translating one voice into another voice. From day two, we're translating those stories. So we make a selection of what's been brought in, and we're translating them in small groups, storyboarding, rewriting them, discovering what it means to bring them alive in English while capturing as much as possible of the texture and colour and rhythm of the original story. And then finally, on day 3, the stories are adapted for performance and presented to an audience of children and parents, often those parents witnessing their language being celebrated and spoken on stage for the first time in a school context, and the performance will flip between the languages, so it's comprehensible for most people most of the time. And they get a chance to vote X Factor style for the best story that features in audio recording on the Translation Nation website. So that's a brief overview of the project.
My turn?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to, it's really interesting the statistics that Dylan gave us about what's actually going on in people's homes and this idea of a kind of home language and are children speaking it, are their families speaking it? And we know that's already quite a diverse picture. When it comes to the classroom, it's even more diverse because you've got the different languages there, but you've also got, without that family support, I think if you come at a project from the angle of family, it's very different from if you come at it from the angle of the classroom, because you've got a very different mix that you're dealing with, different fluency profiles if they do have some fluency in what's called the home language. Is it written? Is it oral? So, and then you've got, as Sarah said, the kind of monolingual English-speaking kids, so it's how you deal with that situation.
I think we've got a little example of that. I'm going to flick there. This is on day 1, and you had a very mixed class. It had quite a large Somali community. It had a lot of monolingual children, and it had quite an unconfident, newly qualified teacher who was saying, I just don't know how I'm going to get this vocab out of these kids. And when we started talking about teeth, because an animal cropped up in one of our stories, just in this corner are some of the suggestions that came up. You have munchers, incisors, chewers, canine, gnashers, adult teeth, crisp, white, milky, baby teeth. And then this Somali kid said, pearly whites. And out it came, sort of at the time that this newly qualified teacher was least expecting that she'd get that level of register happening.
So what we try with Translation Nation, the central idea is an openness. So both in the source for the story, the process by which it's translated, but also the outcome, the performance at the end. So when we ask students to bring stories in, it can be in any format. And they'll come in on scraps of paper, they'll come in, one class that I was working with, a girl brought in the Turkish published edition of Puss in Boots, and that was fine as well. They've come in on kind of MP3s, they've come in kind of audio recorded, all sorts of formats. And sometimes they just come in, someone's explained the story to them, and then they'll explain it in their own words in a mixture of languages. So any kind of source format is fine, and that's really an important part of the project, because it means that, you know, all these different languages and registers and dialects and fluency profiles can be accommodated, because you just bring the story in whatever way you're able. And we had one student who was a monolingual English speaker, so he just went to his next door neighbour who was Cypriot and asked him to tell him a story. So it really is open in that format. And then the process is very open because it's a group endeavour. So once they've chosen which stories are going to be translated, a group of students does this together. And while one of those students will probably have some access to the original language, the others won't necessarily, but they'll all have different skills to bring to it. And very often they decide to translate the stories into a kind of very local register, sometimes reset them in the local environment using kind of local vocabulary. Sometimes they like to not do that and keep them very formal, and they'll have different skills in different English registers. And we often find that some of the students who have another language that might be completely unrelated, the fact of being bilingual gives them a certain flexibility and a certain role to play in the group and a kind of comfort with this kind of work. So because it's done as a group, it pulls on the kind of communal repertoire of skills in the classroom. And then the other thing is the output. So they produce a performance. And often these performances are kind of quite hybrid. They'll have some bits of original vocabulary and some sort of cultural images thrown in there, and they'll have some very kind of London images as well. So at every stage, while we're giving a very clear structure for how the project works, each stage is very open to the local kind of specifics of how that needs to be done.
I think you've got some examples. So that would be a school I worked at. Those are the stories that got selected to perform from, let's say, a crop of about 12. And what was interesting was the Thirsty Crow had 3 different endings. The Somali one was the most pessimistic by a long chalk. And 2 others, and it's a traditional tale about this crow needing to access water. And then after I'd done the workshop, I actually got given an Indian version where he sees an ad for someone sucking from a straw at a bus station, and realises that that's the way forward. So you've got another modern take on it from Seagull Publishing there. So it goes in different directions. I think another important point, a school I was working at in Camden had a very big Filipino community, and they had lots of Tagalog stories to bring in. But I was really worried because demographically, the nature of a lot of their parents' jobs was such that they weren't available to come in. And I was worried that they would be very underrepresented. And actually, that was the most motivated community in that particular school. And parents saw that for their children, having another language really was an asset, and being a translator could be a viable and sometimes reasonably well-paid career choice, not literary. They worked really, really hard at transliterating and sending in the stories, and they won with The Origins of the Pineapple they'd done, which had a big Spanish influence. So the project kind of self-managed itself in terms of making itself democratic for a community that seemingly might have been disadvantaged. Yeah.
Do you want to put up the final quotes?
Big fat quote. It's the longest one.
I'll let you read that. So this is from the EAL coordinator at this school. And we had extremely positive feedback from staff about the impact it had on kids. And I think one of the reasons why they appreciated it is because it did take in everyone. And it can get really difficult when you're trying to pin down particular communities once you get inside the school, because if they've got 30 different communities there and you're only offering a project for 1 or 2 of them, it makes it more difficult for them to timetable and more difficult for them to kind of say, have we done our bit for everyone? So it's useful to have some projects that are broader scope.
And one of the things that's interesting about that is you're talking about really rigorous work, editing it, and that drafting that you don't normally have time for in school. But what we noticed, and that ties in with the openness that Sam's talking about in Translation Nation, is that because initially it's not about spelling and grammar, and you absolutely want them to punch above their weight. It doesn't matter how they get it down. It doesn't matter what source it comes in on. And so having had a very open initial door, you end up going to something that's really quite complex in literacy at the other end of the journey. Oops, sorry, I've jumped empathy. And for the teachers as well, that's a huge thing of imagining themselves again into the child's position, and where the child is the expert, so that sort of role reversal. And that's just the best quote ever. I actually nicked this from, I nicked it from Dylan. I was doing some work for Pop-Up, and we were talking about Translation Nation, and she said, the thing is, Sarah, Google Translate doesn't do flair, and it doesn't do voice. So we're on to next steps, really.
So we won't go into loads of detail about translators in schools, but what we're looking to do now is try and widen the pool of people with the confidence and skills to deliver these kind of workshops, which is what Translators in Schools works on. And there is a Translation Nation slide as well. Oh no,
it's a big translate.
Big translate. So the other thing we're doing is kind of public events where we take some of the work we've done for Translators in Schools and kind of we did this event in the Claw Ballroom at South Bank as well, where we had about 60 kids there all translating 10 different
picture books from 7 different languages that they don't have in a day. But so I think the thrust there is that a bit what you were referring to, Dylan, with Fusion. It's an amazing project. You get these stories out. It's reasonably expensive. It's quite unwieldy to manage in some ways. And what we want to look at is how this is embedded, how we pilot more materials that teachers can take up, how we have translators in residence in a school to pilot projects, and we research that and we write the materials to go with it. So this is all coming together at the moment under the Translators in Schools banner, of which Translation Nation is one of the programs, one of the projects that we run. And alongside the pop-up films that you can see at lunchtime is the world exclusive premiere of Sam and I looking like we've just been exhumed in a short film about translators in schools, and it tells you about the Big Translate at the South Bank, and it tells you about our training program. So do take the advantage to see that if you can, and otherwise it's on the Translators in Schools website.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.